Hello, this video is to show you how to use the simplex method. The simplex method is an approach to solving linear programming by hand. So we're going to use slack variables, tableaus, and we'll talk about pivot variables as well. The simplex tableau uses the row operations to solve for the optimality, and I'll walk you through the example for that. So here we go. We have a problem that says we're maximizing, and this is the z equals 2x subscript 1 minus x subscript 2 plus x subscript 3, which is also known as the objective function. We also have these three right here, which are our constraints and restrictions, and these are all in equality right here. Moving on to the next process, which is then converting our inequalities into equality constraints. So because, again, these are inequalities, we're going to make this into equality instead. So what does that look like? It's exactly the same equation. The only difference is changing our inequalities into equal sign. So that's what we did right here. Change it into equal sign. Now on the objective function right here for the z, because it says it's maximizing, we're taking all the variables and putting it on the other side where z is and keeping z as positive. Now if the direction was asking us to find the minimum, then we're going to do the opposite. We're going to take the z and bring it to the other side of the variable and make z into a negative. So that's the two differences that we need to pay attention to. Now we're going to go ahead and add the slack variables. Now in the slack variables, you may see in the textbooks as some of them will continue on the x variable. So in these equations that we have x subscript 1, x subscript 2, x subscript 3 for the maximum of all of those guys right here. So in some of the textbooks, they will continue and use x subscript 4, x subscript 5, and x subscript 6 instead of s. So I'm using s for my slack variables, so that way I know those are my slack variables and not the variables that originally started with. So here are my slack variables. I have slack variable s1, slack variable s2, slack x3, and that's going to start us off. Also notice there is no slack variable in the objective function, and that equation is also equal to 0. So when we brought all of the variables over to the side of z, we still have to set it equal to something, and in this case it equals to 0 since they all moved over to the left side of the equal sign. So if you're looking for augmented form, you need to make sure that you have it in equality equations. You need to make sure you have slack variables, and you need to make sure that your objective function is all set equal to z, whether the z comes over with the variables or the variables come to the z. Alright, now we're ready to do the tableau. So going into Tableau, we are putting this into a table. I would use the Excel for this, so that way you can see all the movement that goes on. So the equation I'm putting down is equation 0, 1, 2, 3. And then from there, 0 is this part right here, the equation 0. I'm going to call this equation 0. This is equation 1, equation 2, and then equation 3 right here. So I also have z variables, and then I just list all my variables. I have x1, x2, x3. Then I also have a slack 1, slack 2, slack 3. And then what we call the right-hand side is the number on the other side of the equal sign. So that's everything that we need right there. Now let's go ahead and talk about the table. So in our equation 0 right here, I'm only putting just the coefficients into each of the columns right here. So for my z column, I'm putting in 1 because there is a 1 in front of that z right there. For x1 value of my equation 0, it's going to be negative 2 is my coefficient right there. Coefficient of positive 1 for x2, so x2 positive 1. For x3 is negative 1, so negative 1 right there. And I do not have any slacks, so I put zeros for the slack variables right there. Then on the right hand side, since it's equal to 0, I'm going to go ahead and put 0 right there. So let's continue and fill in the rest. For equation 1, no z's. So in my z place right here, I have a 0. For my x1, I have a 3 coefficient, which is coming from here. For my x2, coefficient should be positive 1. For x3, positive 1. And then I have slack 1, which is positive 1. So I do have a slack right there. But I don't have slack 2 or slack 3, so those are zeros. And then on the right-hand side, it is equal to 60 right there. Equation 2, I have coefficient of positive 1, no z's. Then I have coefficient of negative 1 for x2. For x3, we have positive 2 coefficient. And then for the slacks, I do not have an S1 slack. So in this case right here, I put a 0 for the S1. I do have an S2, so I put a 1. No S3, and the right-hand side becomes 10 right there. So the last equation, no Z, so I have a 0 right there. I have an 1 coefficient for x1, positive 1 for x2, negative 1 for x3, no S1 or S2, so we have zeros right there. We have a 1 for S3, and then 20 on the right-hand side. So that's the setup of the simplex tabular. So now from here, we're going to do row operations. So we'll walk you through on that. So let's go ahead and do that. Our goal is to make it look like this, where we're looking down at each of the columns to find our solution. In this column Z, I have a 1, and then all the other cells are equal to 0. This is what we're looking for. So for each one, as we go down each column for x1, x2, x3, etc., they should all have something similar where we have a 1 somewhere, and then we have zeros for all the other places. Now the ones cannot be in the same row, because when we are done, we're going to go down the columns, and wherever the 1 is, we move over to see what the right-hand answer is. So in this case, right-hand answer is 0. But again, we didn't do any process yet right now. We just set it up. So each one, we're going to do something like that, where x1, wherever that might be, we just move over to the right-hand side. That's going to be our answer. So this is the reason why the ones cannot be in the same row. Again, we want to have a 1 and a 0 for all the others. So far we have these two, which are 1s, and these two, we have a 3 and negative 2. So you may ask yourself, well, which one do I use for this one right here? So for each one of these process, you're going to use what we call the ratio test. And so the ratio test, we're taking the right-hand side numbers, which are these guys right here, and we're going to divide it out by the coefficient, which is over here. Each one of these are going to be coefficients. And then select the smallest positive ratio. So for example, the 0 divided by negative 2 becomes 0. 60 divided by 3 becomes 20. 10 divided by 1 becomes 10. 20 divided by 1 becomes 20. So looking at this, we're looking for the smallest positive ratio. So the smallest positive ratio would be a 10. So that's going to be the one that we're going to use. So this one right here is going to be called the pivot variable right here, because this is the one we're going to use to make all of these guys become 0. So these guys need to be 0, and then this needs to be 0 as well. Now, because this is already a 1, we do not need to fix the equation of that row. And so we're just going to use that row as is, and then go ahead and do the row operation. For the row operation, you can either add, subtract, multiply, or divide numbers to get the new set of numbers that you need. I like to usually start from the bottom and work my way up. So in this first case right here, I'm going to take my E3 or equation 3, which is this part right here, and I'm going to subtract it from E2, which is this part right here. So for the row operation, each of these cells, I'm taking this, subtracting it from here, taking this, subtracting from here, and all of this to fix this whole row right here, so that way we get a new row. So let me show you how that looks like. So for example, let's take my E3, which is 1 right here, and we're going to subtract it from E2, which is here, and that's going to give me the 0 that I need for that row right there. So doing the same thing, we're going to go ahead and take this 1 right here, subtract it from this right here. We have a negative and a negative, which equals positive, so you're going to get a positive 2. Continuing on, we have is negative 1 minus, and then we take the 2 right here, continue right there, 2. So negative 1 minus 2 gives me negative 3. The zeros will obviously become zeros right here, so we continue on. I have 0 minus 1 right here, which becomes negative 1. 1 minus 0, which is 1. And then I have a 20 minus 10, which gives us 10 right there. Okay, so let me go ahead and clear this out so you can see what that looks like. So this is the new equation for that row. And so I've kind of highlighted this right here just to show that this is 0. I'm done with this row right here. So now we have to work on either one of these two rows to make it into a 0. So I'm just going to work my way up. So I'm going to go with this next one right here. To cancel this 3 out right here, I would have to take my one pivot variable and multiply it by 3 so that I can cancel those guys out. I have E1, which is 3, minus 3 times this pivot right here becomes 0. So that becomes 0 for this new cell right here. So each one, we're going to work on that one. So this next one right here, I have is 1 minus 3 times E2 was this right here, which is negative 1. So that's negative 1. So negative 1 times negative 3 becomes positive 3, so that becomes a 4 for that new cell. So I continue on right here. I have a positive 1 minus 3 times 2 should give me 6. So that's 1 minus 6 gives me negative 5. Then we have is 1 minus 3 times 0, which is 0, so that becomes 1. This right here is 0 minus 3 times 1, which becomes a negative 3. This is 0. And then we have the last one right here, which is 60 minus 3 times 10 should be 30. And that's going to give us the new cell right there. So that becomes 0 right there. We have one more row to work on, so it's this row right here. So with that row, again, I want to eliminate this and make this into a 0 using my pivotal variable of 1 right here. So we're going to go ahead and multiply 2 to this whole row right here, and we're going to add it to the 0 row right there. So I have is negative 2, and I'm going to add 2 to the pivot right here, giving me the 0 that I need. And we have is the 1 right here, 1 plus 2 times negative 1, because that's coming from here. So that gives me negative 2. 1 plus negative 2 is negative 1. Then I have is negative 1 plus 2 times, and this row right here will give us 2. So that gives me 4. 4 minus 1 is 3. This one becomes 0 and 0, so that's good. 0 plus 2 times 1 is 2. 0 and 0, that's good. We have a 0 and 10. So 0 plus 2 times 10, that should give us the 20 right there. Okay, now let's go on to the next one, which is our x2. So doing the same process, we're looking for the ratio, because now I have a 2, a negative 1, 4, and negative 1. So I'm not sure which one is it. So we're going to go ahead and do the ratio test. So taking our right-hand side, dividing by the coefficient for each one of those. So we have 20 divided by negative 1 gives us negative 20. 30 divided by 4 should give us 7.5. 10 divided by negative 1 gives me negative 10. 10 divided by 2 should give me 5 right there. So we're looking for the smallest positive number, and it looks like 5 is going to be the one. So that's going to be our pivot right there. It's this 2 right here. Now I need to change this though. I cannot have a 2. I need to make this into a 1, and then the rest of these guys become a 0 right there. So how do I make this 2 into a 1? I can always multiply or divide as well. If I multiply by the half, to that 2, that's going to give me the 1. But if I multiply by half, I need to multiply by half for all of these guys right here. So if we do that, that becomes negative 3 over 2, 0, negative half, positive half, and 5. So now that becomes the pivotal variable, and we're going to use that to make sure all of these become the zeros right there. So working our way up, I have is negative 1 and 1, so if we add those together, that will give me the 0 that I need. And doing the same thing, we're going to add each one of these. So we'll add the 2 and the negative 3 halves. And again, you can put this in the calculator to get that number. Zeros will be zeros, 1 plus a negative half, 0 plus half, 10 plus 5. That's going to give us our new numbers right there. Working our way up. So I have a 4 right now. To make that into a 0, I would have to multiply this right here by a 4. So that way it could be a 4 minus 4. And that's going to give us something like this, where we take equation 1 and we're going to multiply by negative 4 to the third equation and work each of the cells just like that. So it'll be 1 minus 4 times the 0, negative 3 minus 4 times the negative half, 0 minus 4 times the half, 30 minus the 4 times the 5. Okay, and the last row that we have is going to be, if I have negative 1, and if I add it to this right here, that's going to give us the 0 that we need. So if we add each of those cells together, that will give us the new cell that we need, which becomes this right here. And so again, this is the 1, everything is 0. We're done with this column, and we would move on to the next column. Now, as I move on to the next column, keep also in mind some strategies is to see where would the next one come, because my Z right now has the value of 1. So right now, if I'm done, this right here, if I go over here, will move over, and 25 would be the answer. For x1, the 1 is right here in this equation 2, so if I move over, 15 would be the answer right here. So x3, same thing. This right here is in the third equation, so if I move over, 5 becomes the answer. So by process of elimination, this right here should be my next 1 right there, because that's the only cell or the row that hasn't received a 1 to get that answer right there. Okay, so have that in mind. This is what we need right here to become a positive 1. So going on with the process, if I do my ratio test and I do each one, the 25 divided by 3 over 2, giving us 16.7. 10 divided by negative 11 gives me negative 0.91. 15 divided by half gives me 30. 5 divided by negative 3 halves gives me negative 3.33. As I mentioned before, this is the location where we need to have a positive 1 and the rest of the cells become 0. But we have a problem because this right here is a negative 0.91. So this is not the smallest positive number. So therefore, this is where you maximized and you've completed the process. So now you are ready to wrap up and get your final answers right here. So our Z is equal to 25, but because if I go down the column of Z, the 1 right there, moving over to the right-hand side is 25. My X1 will become 15. My X2 will become 5. Now what does X3 become? Since we do not have anything, actually X3 will become a 0 right here. So X3 is a 0. Reading on the chart still, so I have slack variable 1, which becomes 10. And my slack variable 2 and 3 become zeros because, again, the same process that we talked about for x3 right here, this does not have a positive 1 in each one of these columns, so that means this is a 0. So going back to the original problem right here, it's asking us to find the maximum value for z, right? For the x subscript 1, x subscript 2, and x subscript 3. So we have found in this process right here that z equals 25 is the maximum value when we have x subscript 1 is equal to 15, x subscript 2 is equal to 5, and x subscript 3 is equal to 0. So this is the process using the simplex method to put it into equality equations using slack variables, using tabulars, and finding the pivotal variable as well.